Welcome back to Members Welcome Podcast, brought to you by To Be Agency, where we share new innovations, learnings, and implementations in our practice as community managers and strategists. To learn more about building your online community, visit www.tobeagency.co. So last episode, we all talked about how awesome the Porsche brand and their marketing and media strategy is. But the takeaway we got was, when you have a good product, everything else becomes easy. Community will form on their own almost, right? And the anecdote Andrew shared with that, we should also look at what's not working. If there's no one talking about your product services or, forming a community, a casual community outside of it, maybe the brands and companies should also look at why that's not happening, right? So I thought that was a really good antidote and point of view to share with our audiences. Today, we're going to switch gear, but just a little bit, and talk to Jeremy about the sim racing world and the community and how the community has affected the rise of esports. I think we all watched Gran Turismo, the movie, right? And I learned so much about the esports and the sim racing. So I'm looking forward to learn more about it from Jeremy. So, hi, Andrew and Jeremy. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Jeremy, so I personally, besides that movie, don't know much about the sim racing world. So could you tell us a little bit about how you personally got into it, like what attracted you to it, and then what are you tinkering with at the moment?
Sure. So sim racing, for anyone that doesn't know, it's basically racing in a simulator. When we used to say simulator, we used to think like it was some big thing that only manufacturers would have, and it was only for professional race car drivers. But now it's kind of changed. Sim racing hardware has become a lot more accessible just to normal people. There's different levels of the hardware as well, so you can go from like beginner hardware to advanced professional hardware. And it's all very accessible. You don't have to know somebody in order to get that kind of gear. But for me, I think getting started in sim racing really just happened during the pandemic. And I think it was a combination of Drive to Survive, the Netflix series kind of getting released. Also, I mentioned like Road to Le Mans, the Porsche series. I just started getting a lot more into motorsports because of Drive to Survive, and I think sim racing was kind of a natural progression into that because I don't know, I just have a lot of respect for those race car drivers in terms of what they're doing. And a lot of us might think they're just driving in circles over and over again, but after sim racing, I have a lot more respect for them, because obviously it's not easy. There's a lot of very, very technical details when it comes to sim racing that, most people might not really be aware of. And I think for me, actually, the challenge of that, the challenge of learning all of those little technical details is really what has kind of kept me or kept my interest or kept me engaged with sim racing.
Gotcha. And it's different from playing video games, like, right?
Yeah. So there's like Forza. There's what are called like Simcade, like sim arcades. They're usually less realistic in terms of the physics, in terms of the immersion. And then there's actual simulators. Like a couple examples are iRacing. Another one's Assetto Corsa. But those ones, the physics are really made to match real life. And usually in the simulators, they also give you like LiDAR scanned racetracks. So what that means is like when you're driving in the sim on the tracks, you literally feel every bump as if it was on the real racetrack. You feel every curb. One of the sims I just started playing, they just released Rain, and it's insane to see, like, and actually I watch a few YouTubers who are also professional GT3 drivers who also use the sims to practice, and they say it's nearly the same as real life. The only thing that's missing is obviously the G force, from driving. But yeah, the realism is just insane now, and I think that is a big draw for a lot of people as well, is just being able to immerse themselves in something that they normally wouldn't really have access to.
Right. So from what I gather, it's like the sim racers actually see it as a sport activity. It's not just like playing video games to kill some time, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I think from what, our passing conversations, I know that you 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 are, 3D printing parts for your rigs, for your cats and like matching helmets and all that stuff, right? So what kind of drove you to do like all that stuff, making your own parts and gears for your rig and how seriously you're taking it? Like what kind of influenced that or made you go down that path?
yeah. I think I've always just been a tinkerer. I've always liked to build things, and as I got into sim racing, there's there one of the things that I started building was my own like sim racing steering wheels. So
Oh,
so yeah, and actually you can see like right here, that's my 3D printer. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It was kind of just a natural progression for me. Like I like to build things, and sim racing kind of gave me stuff that I wanted to build to use for myself.
do you think that's pretty common in the community, like what you're doing?
Yeah, I think
Like,
yeah, there's definitely there's always like a DIY. I find in all of my hobbies there's always like a DIY camp, and then there's also the people that just their time is more valuable. For me, it's more like I like to tinker, I like to learn about how things work. So I'm definitely always on the DIY side of things, but like I said, all of these new hardware manufacturers in sim racing have made it so like you don't have to DIY your own stuff. You can just go and buy it.
I wanted to ask you, like, in every community, there's always like, I guess, different levels of like raving fans or, people who are like super passionate about what that community is about. I'll tell you a story, right? So, my friend Eugene, he was living in Denver and his buddy had like a sim rig set up, right? And I don't remember what game it was, if it was an actual, like a set of Corsa or was like more like
Yeah.
Forza or whatever. But I guess the point was that he he got to his friend's house, takes his shoes off, goes downstairs into the basement. The sim rig is set up there, the monitors and all that kind of stuff. And basically, he his friend goes to the closet and takes out a box, and inside the box is a pair of like white Puma like shoes. And then
driving
my
shoes.
friend's like, "Wait, what are these for?" He's like, "Dude, these are my driving shoes." And Eugene's like, "Oh, okay." So he's like, "But go upstairs and get your shoes because you should put them on when you're driving because it's easier to drive with shoes on." Eugene goes upstairs, puts his shoes on. He starts racing like in the on a track or whatever. And he wasn't competing against anyone. It was just like with bots or
Yeah.
whatever. And the first corner, Eugene just dive bombs like he just dive bombs like all the cars in front of him. Like you do when
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
playing Gran Turismo like on PlayStation, right?
yeah.
And his friend looks at him and he goes, "Dude, stop! You can't do that."
No, no,
You know,
like he like went and paused the game, stops the game, and says, "Dude, what are you doing?"
like
Yeah, you
mad
could have
at
just
him.
killed someone.
Like, yeah, you're gonna kill someone. Yeah. So like, okay, so the reason I bring that story up is because obviously like there's people who have no idea about sim racing and like they'll dive bomb every corner and they don't know about penalties and things like that, to the people who are like, I got a pair of driving shoes, in my
Yeah.
closet. And my first question is, number one, do you have a pair of driving shoes for your rig? And then number two is like, what do you think those categories are of like the enthusiasts within like the sim racing world or community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, I don't have a real pair of race car or racing shoes. I just use some like they're just really thin. They're like little slippers basically with a little rubber on the bottom.
Yeah.
Um but yeah, in terms of like the different levels, I guess, of sim racers, there's definitely the hobbyists, right? I would consider myself between like a hobbyist and someone that kind of takes it a little bit competitively. but yeah, there's hobbyists, there's people that are into it for the competition, so they'll compete in leagues, they'll compete in sponsored races for prizes, things like that. And then there's the professionals, right? And the professionals, they usually are trying to compete for a manufacturer's sim racing team. So like Williams Esports, Mercedes AMG, Alpine, all of those teams, they actually have their own dedicated esports teams as well. And same with Porsche, right? Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I think all of these different categories of sim racers, I think each of them, I think the hobbyists, there's some of them that have like aspirations to kind of move into competitions and move into professional. But I think that only has really become a thing recently because of the in real life, the IRL race car drivers are starting to use the same sims that we have access to. Like Max Verstappen,
Like
for
for Steve
example.
Verstappen, I was just gonna
Yeah,
say, yeah.
yep, yeah. Like Verstappen, obviously he spends 9 months out of the year just traveling around the world doing these races almost every weekend. And then on his off time, you see him start to stream on like Twitch, and he stays dedicated to his craft by sim racing. So I think as sim racers, seeing professionals who are using the same tools that we are to just improve, to have fun. I don't know. It opens up a new path for us too. It's just like I know I'm never gonna become a professional race car driver, but being able to have access to the same things that professionals use, there's a certain draw to that for me. It's challenging. It gives me the same or the same feeling of challenging that I'm sure race car drivers face, when they're on the track, doing their thing.
So two thoughts on that. I'm curious to hear your response. So one is Verstappen versus like Hamilton, like they're kind of like different generations
Yep.
of like being at the peak of their game. I will see it like kind of like Nadal and Federer and Djokovic, and then like the new guys that are coming, or we'll see. They're not as good as Verstappen is compared to Hamilton, right?
Yep.
But I think Hamilton, Lewis, like kind of famously said, like he doesn't like to be on sims,
Yeah.
right?
He
Like he
hates the
doesn't like
sim.
to
Yep.
he doesn't like the sim, and it's like the old guy who likes vinyl and turntables versus the new guy, right? Who has all these tools at his disposal. And I personally, being new to F1 and just kind of like you, like got into it because of Drive to Survive and the Netflix thing. I actually gravitated. So I don't care for any teams. I don't, if Porsche obviously put a team in, I'd probably just go straight for them, right? But I don't have any allegiance to a specific team. And so, but I definitely like Verstappen, obviously because he wins a lot, right? But
Yep.
like I get a lot of his media on my YouTube, right? Like his shorts when he's like, you know, when he does something stupid on the sim and he's like, what the F? And like those are just like the like human moments, like,
Yep.
and he's like in his room somewhere in his house.
Yeah.
It looks like it could
Yep.
be your room or my room or whatever,
Right.
and like it's interesting to see. And I didn't like, so do you think that with like the Lewis Hamilton generation and now Verstappen kind of being at like the peak of his powers and Red Bull and all that, um, does that change the way that community gets built in sim racing and maybe just in motorsport in general? Because a lot of people aligned around teams and things like that, and maybe now people are aligning around a driver, right? Or
Yeah.
like
That's what you're touching on is something I've thought about this too. It's like because I'm the same way. I don't really have an allegiance to a team, but I'm really drawn to the drivers. Their personalities, the way that they race. Like one driver that my favorite driver is actually Fernando Alonso, because he's the oldest guy on the grid and he's consistently competing at the front, even without a car that should be at the front. And that's all a result, really, of his racecraft, the way that he thinks, the way that he approaches the races. Like, he just does very small things that other drivers just don't even think about. Like, for example, like if they're all lining up on the grid for the start of the race, he'll, like, he's been seen where he'll like spin his back wheels to warm up the tires a little bit more, but then he also does that for his teammates. So as he's driving up to his spot, he'll spin out his wheels for his teammate so that his teammate has a little bit more traction when they're going off of the line, you know? So there's just all of these tiny nuances. And I think going back to the whole Verstappen Lewis thing and what that means for community, yeah, I totally think that we're coming to a point where fans are a lot more dedicated to the drivers than the teams themselves. Obviously, there's still a lot, Ferrari is one of the biggest in terms of their like team loyalty, brand loyalty. Um, but yeah, as more people get into sim racing, as more people kind of connect with the drivers through the actual skill of driving, I think I think people are going to shift more towards, just sticking with the drivers. At least that's what I'm doing. Because yeah, I think just in terms of the teams, it's like to me, from an outsider looking in, the teams are for the most part the same. You know what I mean? It's like it's
Yeah, it's
it's
just
a bureaucracy.
a bunch of
Yeah,
billionaires, right?
yeah.
Who like financing a dream of theirs.
It's like the brands don't have personality, really. I mean, and sure, yeah, they do have personality, but when it comes to the actual racecraft, the driving, the skill required, I think myself as a wannabe professional driver, like I'm drawn a lot more to the drivers than the teams themselves.
So let's talk about the brands then. So like we're talking about F1, which is, a whole
Mhm.
echelon of things, but like a lot of people don't know that like there are some very well attended, watched, known sort of like lower level motorsports in the real motorsports world, but also the equivalency on the in the
Yeah.
sim racing world, right? So like there's like the GT3 class, and you've got the IMSA series, and all these sorts of things, and that aren't quite F1, right? But the same, like there's celebrity drivers, right? There's teams that everyone gravitates towards, and specific to sim racing. And what I've noticed actually is that Audi as a brand, over the last like maybe 20 years, um, has really evolved in terms of taking market share from brands like BMW or even Mercedes, when it comes to like younger demographics and younger audiences, right? It was like, I remember like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, everybody wanted to buy a 3 Series when they could afford to get like their first kind of like sports luxury car. And now it's like an A4 or an A5. You're seeing a lot more of this. And what I've also noticed is that looking at those big brands, Audi, BMW, Mercedes, what have you seen them investing in when it comes to sim racing and the communities that form around their brands, or around like the teams that their brands have in sim racing? So now we're talking about like less like the Super Bowl like of F1, and we're talking more about like lower level leagues that are maybe more accessible to like the common person, and even more so now because of sim racing. So I'm curious to see how these brands try to build communities within sim racing, or if they do that at all.
Yeah. It's interesting you kind of talked about how Audi is kind of taking market share from BMW and Mercedes. I think there's a lot kind of to that. I think BMW and Mercedes are kind of shying away from like their racer heritage a little bit. Whereas Audi has kind of been digging into it. I mean, actually, Audi just, they got rid of their GT3 program, but because they're going to be joining F1 in, 2026. So I think on one hand that has something to do with the loss of market share for BMW and Mercedes, but in terms of sim racing and these brands, a lot of the brands actually put on their own race series where you can only drive BMW cars, for example. Porsche, they also have the Esports Super Cup, and that's essentially a esports version of their Carrera Cup that they have in real
which is
life.
which is very famous. It's like it's
Yeah,
one of the it's actually in Europe, it's just like like they're known as the king of the Nürburgring, because like that's where they built their cars and tested them, and were and Porsche make only races. Like there's some really legendary drivers in one of those Porsche only make races. Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Yeah, and I think also like these brands they see that, sim racing is getting a lot bigger. It's really is a tool, and I think these bigger brands, they're also promoting esports or promoting sim racing in itself by bringing people up from sim racing into IRL racing. So
That's
they're
Gran
they're
Turismo, the
showing
movie. That's the
exactly.
movie, basically, right?
Yep, exactly.
And
And I
tell the
think,
audience, Jeremy, about the movie and Nissan, and like you can finish your thought, but maybe explain a little bit about how that transition
yeah,
happens.
yeah. So Gran Turismo, it used to be it is a PlayStation game. And the movie was basically telling the story of this guy, Jan Marlborough, who started as a sim racer on Gran Turismo, and then Nissan, they saw that sim racing could be used as a tool. They took a risk on this guy and basically said, "Hey, we wanna do basically a campaign around putting you into a real race car." And so all of that happened in real life. Like he did progress from sim racing into racing, doing the real thing. And yeah, obviously that created a lot of buzz for sim racing. So yeah, I think just having brands that kind of are willing to take the risk, and actually, I think it's less of a risk now, just because professional drivers are using it as a tool. It's also that like these professional drivers, they have a lot of influence. They have their own communities as well. So as a sim racer, or even as someone that doesn't sim race, if they're a fan of racing, like if they see their idols or the people, the athletes that they like to watch, they see them having fun or just challenging themselves through sim racing, it's a natural thing for their audience to kind of want to get involved as well.
Yeah, it's I think it's really interesting when you think about the demographic of the communities within sim racing. And I'm making a lot of assumptions here, so try to validate me
Mhm.
or check me here, but my initial thought is that look, a lot of the people who get into sim racing, like they're very technically oriented. Um, they probably have some money, like a disposable income, to be able to buy like, the things that are needed, right? It's not a cheap thing to like get into, right? You need hardware, you coaching, those kind of things.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say they're always super
Okay.
technical. And I
Okay.
think that's what has made it a lot more, the sim racing in general, just a lot more accessible now. Yeah, there's definitely a cost to it. There's definitely um, like you have to be able to support your own hobby. Any hobby has its
Yeah.
expenses, has its things. Sim racing is same as everything else. There are things you have to pay an upfront cost, but then once you pay that, you can use the gear for as long as it lasts.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a lot cheaper than buying the actual car. So
Yeah,
by any
seriously.
means, that's still
And
a
I
fraction
have
of that, right?
yeah, and I'm basically buying every car that's available in the world.
Okay, so it sounds like there wasn't like, a movement that happened for sim racing and then all the brands start looking at it. It sounds like it just because there's a lot of people out there who love playing those video games. And once the technology and the hardware started becoming more accessible, just like you said, Jeremy, I think, those guys who play those video games probably love cars. And then now there's like a step that's closer to driving the actual car. Like if they can't, I don't see why they wouldn't get on it, right? And then once that starts to happen, like the community kind of form around themselves, like you said, like for the parts or like YouTube channels on how to do X, Y, and Z. And then people comment, and then I'm sure there's tons of Reddit threads about all of that. So because the movement happening on the ground level, so to speak, like naturally grassroots with people doing all these things, then that's when the brands start taking notice. Like, oh, there's a lot of sim racers out there who are actually really good at driving those cars, right? And and I think for me, from a complete outsider, the connection is pretty natural. It's like if they can, beat the games driving a sim, maybe they can do that in real life too, right?
The realism is just insane, down to like the lap times. Like the lap times that I do in the sim are, they're slower than obviously professional race car drivers, but the professionals in the sim, their times are exactly the same as the real life laps.
Whoa.
So and to add to that, a lot of these sims now, they also use telemetry. So, and what that is it basically tells you like everything the car is doing from like the spring, like the spring ratios. It tells you like how you can see like the your brake and throttle trace, on a graph. And all of that is what they use in real life to coach their drivers. So I think having access to just the same tools that race car drivers are using is just something that's really cool to me to be able to learn these types of things. Obviously it takes a while to understand what the data is telling you. That's just stuff that I like to nerd out on. And I think um, I've always liked to challenge myself, and having access to the data to show me where I need to improve is something that, yeah, it just keeps me coming back, I guess.
Is that a characteristic of people in the sim racing community? Do you feel like that's
Definitely
a
not. Definitely not. I think,
really? Huh.
yeah,
Interesting.
I think so. And there's also a lot of, so actually, I've seen a lot of communities get started through, not a lot, but several pretty large sim racing communities get started from people that didn't have any experience in the past, but really quickly became good at sim racing. And they're willing to share their journey in becoming better and better. And I think a lot of people like to follow those journeys because they want to do the same. They want to improve themselves when it comes to sim racing. So having someone that kind of leads the way for you, or whether it's a creator, whether it's a professional race car driver, just seeing them or learning from them um, keeps them engaged.
This is very interesting because what Jeremy said, it also reminds me of the whole creator economy. Right before we watch this, cinema movies produced by big studios, we're like, wow, that's so cool. But now, like, iPhone camera technology, the software is accessible, AI now, so accessible to us. Like, so many of us who are fans of those things are like, maybe we should do it ourselves because now we actually can, right? And then I know a lot of creators create like awesome content just using their iPhone and
Yep.
getting paid for them posting on YouTube and whatnot. So it like how the sim community is evolving kind of very much reminds me of that. And then those sim racers themselves are part of the creator economy, right? So because they are creating content for a very specific subject.
Yeah, I think it's around this specific demographic. I think it's really interesting that like the whole concept of this is that you gotta like improve a time by like a micro amount
Yeah.
on an average basis is reflective of a certain kind of person that I think wants to do that. And that is actually a really interesting characteristic of a community, right? Who, there's obviously like the upper part of the funnel where you have like the hobbyists or the true hobbyists. And then you have like the middle part, like folks who are like you are kind of in between. And then you have the folks who go down even further. And like that almost like those are really valuable community members to have as a brand or like a community leader. Because like these tenets of like self-improving and just like doing everything you can to squeeze like the last drop of performance out, whether that's okay, I took that corner like a little bit too wide, I gotta come in like a foot. You know what I mean? Like to really cut that time and make sure I keep the exit right, right? Like there's something to be said, I think, about those kind of people who self-identify themselves. And like to me, like, man, like again, when you're looking for like really good community members, those are like to me really valuable folks to have. I don't know what's your take on that, and like these kind of folks who are just hell bent on getting this like incremental like improvement out of their craft, even though they're not
Yeah.
professionals.
Yeah, I think it's like any hobby, right? Most people get into their hobbies, or if you have a lifetime hobby, it's because you're passionate about it, right? And I think for sim racers, it's the same thing. It's just, every weekend there's some race going on, whether it's IndyCar, NASCAR, or F1, GT3, and so whatever it is. So there's like a constant reinforcement as well, right? So it's like every weekend I'll watch a race or something, but that race also inspires me to go hop in the rig and do some laps and try and get better. Um, but yeah, I think those passionate users, the ones that are dedicated to just trying to improve, even though there's not really a defined purpose. Like there's no end goal in mind. It's not like I'm trying to improve my lap time so that eventually I'll be able, to compete at some level. But yeah, I think the other interesting thing when it comes to communities around sim racing is that there's communities that are built around the simulators themselves. There's communities that are built around drivers themselves. There's communities that are built around hardware manufacturers themselves. So it's like, yeah, there's just so many different levels of communities, and I think the interesting thing is that in each of these communities, you'll get that whole universe of different types of sim racers. The people that are just taking it casually, the people that want to improve, the people that want to take it competitively. So, so yeah, I don't know honestly. I don't know where I'm going with that, um, but yeah,
I
I
think,
think just in general, the communities themselves kind of help grow the sport in general.
one thing I realize as you're saying all of this, and again, I'm always, when we have these conversations, I'm trying to draw parallels to the opportunities and the challenges that we have in the communities that with our clients and the ones that we're building on our own. And I'm realizing that, like, really strong communities. And last time we talked about Porsche and how organic those communities formed because of the quality of the product. And that obviously there's a very authentic, a really great community right out there. And as we're thinking about creating communities and forming communities, I think the importance is like you got to make sure that like people are truly passionate about why they're joining your community. And I think sometimes when we form communities around a purpose of we're teaching you so that you can go make more money, or we're helping you do something that has some kind of economic benefit to yourself, you kind of attract the wrong people sometimes. The reason I say that is because a lot of times when you build those communities, it's people who are looking for shortcuts. They're looking for silver bullets. They're looking for things that are just going to be done for them. And they think that, oh, I just joined this community and then I'll figure out, I'll get everything I need. Right. And remember, when we talk about communities, it's all about people like contributing something to make somebody else's life better in the community. I
Yeah.
think a lot of times, and now that I'm kind of, again, like I mentioned, we've been struggling with a couple of communities that, we've been trying to launch. And as I start thinking about the purpose of bringing people in, it's like, oh, we're going to teach you a bunch of things that are going to help you make money. But if they don't end up making money, they're not going to be a good community member to you. Right. And so there's a lot of like selfishness involved with that sort of like that idea. And I think when you look at how you're describing these communities, yeah, they're selfish in a way because they want to improve their times and things like that. But it's like their initial reason for joining is because they really they share this common bond of like just wanting to get better, right, and improve, or they get to that point. And I think those communities form and they become a little bit more authentic, right? Whereas when you're, again, this concept of community driven growth is a really hard thing to pull off, from a balance standpoint, like actually creating a community versus creating something for commerce. And
Right.
so I just, in hearing you talking, I think I'm realizing that also that, look, like you can give them all the reasons they want that sound enticing to them or whatever. But if like they're not really truly passionate about spending time there, they're just looking for silver bullets in a lot of ways. And that's the
Yep.
value they see out of your community, and that community will never truly be valuable, you know?
Going with that, I feel like community, like when you talk about, trading and making money, I feel like community should never form around a outcome. Like if you join a community, you'll make money, or if you join this community, you'll be a good sim racer. A community should not form based on an outcome. So for brands and companies who are trying to do this, if you start a community thinking, this community is for this purpose, it's almost like you're already too far ahead of yourself, right? And as Andrew was saying, I start thinking, it would be really, really, I think starting a community first before you do anything, it's almost like you need to identify the struggles of your target audience, what kind of issues they're having with life or work, or if it's a product, like what kind of issue are they having with using the product, and then kind of form a community around the struggles. Because if it's one person struggling, that there's like 100 people out there who are struggling with the same thing, right? So if you form around a struggle, and then whatever content you provide for that struggle, then that becomes valuable. Because if you might help somebody, and I always think if a piece of advice or media helps one person out there, like that's a little win for anybody, right? So yeah, what you said just made me realize that too.
Yeah, it's like it's about the journey, not the destination. And I think when people
Yes.
join those communities, it's because they want other people to go on that journey with. They see the values that other people that are facing the same challenges, they see the value in being able to connect with them, to share their challenges with each other, to share their solutions with each other. So again, yeah, it comes back to just getting those passionate users and allowing them, or not being so like closed off, to not let them connect with each other, build their relationships, learn from each other, all of that good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we do talk a lot about, communities, the members of community should drive the community itself, and not the other way around, right? So I think we kind of all arrive to that conclusion, right? If it's a good product, community will form around it. If it's a community for good purpose that actually, people get something out of it. I know it's like such a general thing, people get something out of it, but like more specifically, if it helps with a struggle, helps with the challenges
It doesn't
they're
have to be
facing.
a struggle all the time either.
What
It
challenges?
just, I think the better way to put it is like, does it help them do something to make their life better?
Right.
Right? Because like that could be solving a challenge, or it could be there's no challenge. You just did something accredited to them that they may have never even known about. And so it's like this concept of like, how do we make each other's lives better? And sometimes it's because, a lot of times, to your point, Lacey, it's because we're all struggling with something and we're looking for help. But sometimes communities are really awesome because you get this random act of kindness or like whatever, you know what I mean, that you can only get from that community. And that could be another reason.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I
like
think communities in general just kind of add the human element to a brand as well. You it's like when I think about a simulator, or I think about iRacing, I don't necessarily think about iRacing the brand. I think about the people that are online that I race
The
with.
Discord
Yeah,
channel or the
exactly. Yeah,
Facebook group or whatever you're in. That's how you see iRacing. It's like, oh yeah, I
yeah,
interact with iRacing outside of the product through this like Discord community.
yeah.
interesting. So are there like how like with gamers, it's like in stadium e gaming conferences or events. Are there things like that for sim racing too?
Yeah, so I don't think they do any, they call those LAN tournaments, where everybody's like in the same room, they're all using the same network. And the reason they do that is so that people can't really cheat. But
The
they do
speed.
that. Yeah, they do that at like real life races. So I know at like the 24 hours of Le Mans, I believe they have like a parallel esports race that goes on during the event. Um, and I know there's a few events like that where they have like a parallel esports event next to the real life event. One recent one that I saw, so this guy Daniel Morad, he's this Canadian GT3. He races in IMSA GT3, and he has a YouTube channel. and he's also on iRacing, which is the same simulator that I've been using. And he started his own community, and his team, the team name that he's on is called Windward Racing. But basically, that team, they allowed him to bring his sim racing community to the track, and then like they let like 10 or 15 iRacers get in the real life GT3 car and do some laps. So I think there's several creators that are involved professionally in motorsports that are also pushing forward the esports thing. But I think this guy Daniel Morad, he's the first one to really bring together sim racers at a real life event on a real life racetrack to give them like a taste of what it's really like. And I
That's
think we're only
awesome.
going to start. Yeah, I think we're only going to start to see more of that too, as more and more sim drivers become professional race car drivers, because that's a trend that's happening. Like there's
Yeah.
this other guy from iRacing, he's been competing in IndyCar. There's another one that's been competing in NASCAR who actually has been winning events as well. So it's like I think the old paths, the old the old ways to get to professional race car driving are totally changing because of sim racing. And I think that these in-person events that allow sim racers to get a touch or get a taste of the real thing, um, I think it only drives more engagement. It only creates more passion for sim racing and motorsports in general. So yeah, I think you're right. You're right about these in person events kind of pushing things forward for both
Yeah.
sports.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on what you just said, actually. I think having those real life connections and things kind of cements your relationship with your community, right? And like people
Yep.
within each other, because I would imagine most of us will never be able to see a real race car on their track, but because they're part of the community, now they have a chance. That is a
Yep.
huge draw for people to be part of the community. And the second thought I had while you're describing what's happening is like, this is what's happening to sim racing communities. I feel like it's very much a macro trend that's happening to all the different hobby communities, different things that people do just say, like they're becoming, I think it's the macro trend is that people are getting more specific about what they want, what kind of content they want to consume, what community they want to be part of. So, like I think we mentioned a couple episodes ago that by 2025, most of us will belong to these niche communities instead of belong to a big one that covers mainstream culture, I guess. So in a couple years, the mainstream culture might not be a thing anymore, right? My thought was like it's interesting to see that because the NASCAR giant, the traditional races have a huge community, right? Obviously, the esports sim racing are becoming more important than ever. But then, during the beginning of the episode, you also talked about how now people are more, instead of teams or brands, they're standing behind individual drivers, right? So it's like narrowing down from big events to big brands now to big drivers. And then the last part you mentioned that people are actually starting forming community around a not a famous person to start, but a prominent figure in the community, the consumer community, and there's people getting behind those. So I can already see the niche is getting smaller and smaller, but also because it's getting smaller, it might be easier to connect with those people, which I think is a
Yeah, and
wonderful
actually,
thing.
as you were kind of talking through that, I realized there's actually like a community funnel in sim racing. I think for
Yeah.
me, I started out like kind of just learning about Fanatec, which is a hardware brand, and they also sponsor the GT World Challenge events. So like a real racing organization, they're the sponsor or they're the lead sponsor for a huge GT3 racing organization, basically. And so that was my first exposure to like a community in sim racing. But then I kind of moved away from that brand. And as I moved away from that brand, I think I did exactly as you said. I just started following people that were less about the brand and more about the sport itself, you know?
Yeah, I find that fascinating. It's like something we like think is happening, but it's like we just literally talked about it happening in real life. So, so even within these, we're talking about marketing funnels. That's like a very big concept. But then even with something very niche and specific, there is also funnels within those.
Yeah.
So, thank you guys. Like I've learned so much about sim racing and just the car racing world in general today. Like what kind of like takeaway have you guys like do you guys get out from today's conversation? I know that Andrew mentioned a little bit about it. You guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say for sim racing specifically, I mean, one thing that I would take away from it again is just like having those passionate users in your community are the ones that are going to allow they're the ones that enable that community led growth. So really understanding the passions that they're there for, or like what's driving their passion, understanding how to connect with them on that passion is ultimately what will keep somebody in your community and kind of make them an evangelist for your community to help it grow, to bring other people in. Because yeah, as a community grows, like it should become better. There should be more input. There should be more experiences being shared, more knowledge being shared, you know? So yeah, I think it's just my takeaway is just that the passionate users are the ones that you should be building your community around. You shouldn't really be trying to meet the needs of just everybody else, you know, or anybody that's a sim racer.
Yeah, but also it's kind of opposite, like the opposite from how, for a long time we talk about when you start a brand or building something, you should start with the top of the tier, like the luxury users or the people that you can charge most amount of money or the most elite people, right? I think that way still works, but it seems like the tide's shifting a little bit towards, brands need to start paying attention to the everyday people because those are the good people who will drive your growth or your demise for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, and especially in sim racing too, you know, because most sim races are never going to be, you know, real life race car
Right.
drivers. So I think playing into that aspirational nature, like playing into the dream, they're selling the dream. They're not selling the outcome. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I see a lot of car ads like this. They used to sell the dream of you can be rich or you can feel rich being driving this car, and that doesn't really work anymore. I feel like
You
Totally.
don't say
yes,
that anymore. It should just speak for itself. And
Yep.
like what's that say? If you gotta ask how much it is, you can't afford it.
yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
I think
Okay,
what's particularly interesting to me here on this discussion was just the way that you can kind of jump into these sub communities by brand or by driver or by hardware or by you know there's all these subgenres of like these types of hobbies, and the hobbyist communities are always the funnest ones, right? Because they're like involved with people that people like they to do it. Most of them are not professionals. Most of them are prosumers or consumers. And so, like these communities are always just really interesting from a branding standpoint, but more so, I just think the people that are in it, like that question I asked you around, like what motivates these people, what drives them, it's a little bit different from some other communities, right? And so, I think being able to really look at how different these communities kind of form up and then the different directions you can kind of take into them. Do you get more nerdy on the technical end, or are you more on the
Yeah.
competition and the media and the lifestyle and all that stuff? So really fascinating deeper dive into this community for sure.
Yeah. And actually, just to add to that, one thing I noticed about myself is I'm willing to be in multiple communities across different disciplines too, you know? And I think that again is another trend that's happening is like people that are passionate about whatever it is they're passionate about are willing to join multiple communities because, you know, they get something different out of each of those communities.
Yeah. And then putting the time and putting the effort to, communicate and interact with those people in the community, right? I think that's it makes the world better when you have in real life connections and just sort of connection over something that like people you're passionate about. Okay, well, thank you, Andrew and Jeremy, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I think from today's discussion, I think, beyond all the community building and all the marketing talk, I think it's really important for everybody to have something they feel passionate about in life, because I think that makes you a better person. It makes your life, more interesting and more fun, and you will probably grow from it because of your hobby and passion, right? And if you have multiple hobbies and each of them you kind of feel meh about, maybe you should rethink if you should just pick one and go deeper with it, because I think that's the kind of the world, the macro trend we're going. You need to be really, really good at something you do in order to do anything in this world, right? Okay, well, listeners, if you enjoy our discussion today and learned something new from us, please share with anyone who might find this episode helpful. And please hit that follow and subscribe button to get notified. You can also check out the blog page on Toby's website where we share insights in community building, email marketing, and other digital marketing tips. And lastly, don't forget to follow us on social with at Run with Toby. Okay, see you guys next month.